The transport ship drifted silently through the black void of space. Inside, passengers rested, crew members checked controls, and the hum of the engines was the only sound. Gion sat by the small round window of the passenger deck, watching the endless stars. She was traveling alone, taking the long route back to Earth after a work assignment on a distant colony. She had heard stories of trouble along these routes but did not expect anything to happen to her. Across the deck, an alien passenger sat quietly, his tall figure still and calm. His skin had a faint silver-blue tone that shimmered in the ship's lights. His name was Darren, from the aquatic world of Myril. His kind was known for peaceful trade and careful diplomacy, but humans rarely traveled with them. Gion had noticed him before, speaking very little, always observing. Everything seemed ordinary until the first shock hit. The ship trembled, lights flickered, and an alarm wailed through the halls. Gion gripped her seat as another violent shake nearly threw her to the floor. The captain's voice came over the speakers, tense and fast, warning of a meteor storm. The crew rushed to secure the ship, but the impacts grew stronger. Pieces of the hull were taking damage. The final strike was like a thunderclap. Metal groaned and tore. Oxygen alarms screamed. Emergency lights flashed red, and cold air rushed through a crack in the wall. Gion's heart raced as the order to evacuate was shouted. She struggled to find her way through the chaos, passengers pushing toward escape pods. When Gion reached the pods, most were already sealed or gone. She saw one still open but nearly full, only one seat left. As she ran toward it, Darren appeared from another corridor, also heading for the same pod. There was no time to argue. A crew member shoved them both inside, forcing them to squeeze into the small space together. The hatch sealed with a hiss, and moments later, the pod launched away from the dying ship. The escape pod shook violently as it entered the atmosphere of a nearby planet. Flames danced outside the small window as they descended faster than Gion thought possible. Darren reached across and held the safety straps in place when one came loose near her seat. His calm voice told her to breathe slowly, that the pod was built to survive harsh landings. She wanted to believe him. They hit the surface with a jarring crash. Sand and dust rose around them as the pod bounced, skidded, and finally stopped. For a moment neither moved. Gion's ears rang. Her chest felt tight and every muscle was tense. Darren slowly unfastened his straps and checked the pod systems. The readings showed no communication signal and very little stored oxygen left. Outside air was breathable but dry and hot. They stepped out into a strange, endless desert. Golden sand stretched to the horizon, broken only by distant rock formations. The sky was pale, almost white, with a sun that burned brighter than Earth's. The air was dry, stealing moisture from their throats with each breath. Gion shaded her eyes and turned slowly, hoping to see signs of life. There was nothing. The first hours were spent pulling supplies from the pod, water packs, a few ration bars, a survival blanket, and a small toolkit. It was not much, but it was all they had. Gion suggested they stay close to the pod, in case rescue came. Darren agreed but added that they needed shade to avoid heatstroke. Using the blanket and metal rods from the pod's frame, they built a simple shelter against the side of the pod. As the day went on, the temperature climbed higher. Sweat stung Gion's eyes. The sand reflected the sunlight, making everything brighter and harder to see. Darren, though, seemed less bothered. His skin had a faint shimmer that protected him from the worst of the heat. Still, he shared his water with her when her pack ran low. That night the desert changed. The heat faded quickly, replaced by a deep, biting cold. The stars were sharp and clear in the sky, more brilliant than Gion had ever seen. But with the beauty came a strange sound, a distant, low growl carried by the wind. Gion froze. Darren listened, his silver eyes narrowing. "We are not alone," he said softly. They could not see what made the noise, but it moved around them, staying just out of sight. Gion suggested they stay inside the pod with the hatch sealed for the night. Darren agreed. Inside they sat in silence listening. Hours passed, and the growls faded away. By morning they knew they needed to search for a water source. The pod's supply would not last more than 2 days. They took the small toolkit and rationed their food before heading toward the nearest rocky ridge. The sand made walking slow, and the sun punished every step. Gion's legs ached, but Darren set a steady pace, occasionally helping her climb the harder slopes. At the ridge, they found signs of dried riverbeds. Darren examined the sand and said there might be underground water if they dug deep enough. They began to dig, using a piece of broken metal from the pod as a shovel. Hours later, damp sand appeared, followed by small pools of clear water. Relief washed over Gion as she drank, the cool liquid reviving her strength. As they rested, Gion asked about Darren's world. He spoke of Myral's oceans, its floating cities, and the way his people lived in harmony with the sea. She listened quietly, picturing it in her mind. In return, she told him about her home in a small town on Earth, the forests and the rain. They found themselves smiling, despite the danger they were in. When they returned to the pod that evening, the strange growling returned, this time closer. Gion's heart pounded as shadows moved at the edge of the light. Darren placed himself between her and the darkness, his stance steady, his eyes scanning the night. They did not attack, but they lingered until dawn. Gion realized then that survival would not be just about finding food and water. Something was watching them, and sooner or later it might come closer. She glanced at Darren, wondering if they could truly depend on each other. For now they had no choice. The days passed slowly on the deserted planet. HFY and the alien, whom she now called Rin, had settled into a strange routine. Every morning, HFY would search for water while Rin would gather food. They had found a stream in the rocky hills and a patch of edible plants nearby. It was not much, but it was enough to survive. The heat during the day was harsh. The two built a small shelter using large stones and pieces of the crashed ship. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and they would sit close to the fire for warmth. HFY still did not fully trust Rin, but she could not ignore the fact that he had saved her life more than once. One afternoon, while exploring further than usual, HFY slipped on loose gravel and injured her ankle. She tried to stand, but the pain shot through her leg. Rin rushed to her side, his large clawed hand surprisingly gentle as he examined the injury. Without a word, he lifted her in his arms and carried her back to their shelter. HFY watched him in silence. His alien features were still strange to her, skin that shimmered faintly in the sunlight, deep silver eyes, and a voice that rumbled low like distant thunder. Yet there was something in the way he cared for her that felt almost human. Rin found some herbs and crushed them into a paste, wrapping her ankle with strips of cloth. His touch was careful, almost tender. "Rest," he said in his broken version of her language. "You heal." For several days, HFY could not walk far. Rin took on both of their tasks without complaint, bringing her water and food each day. In the evenings they would share stories. HFY about her home, Rin about his world, though his words were simple and often mixed with gestures. One night, as they sat by the fire, Rin pointed to the sky. "Storm," he said, his tone serious. HFY followed his gaze and saw dark clouds forming far in the distance. The wind picked up, and the air grew colder. The storm arrived quickly. Heavy rain poured down, and the wind roared through the valley. Their shelter shook under the force. Rin pulled HFY close to shield her from the cold. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady and strong. When morning came, the landscape had changed. The stream had swollen, and several of their food stores were washed away. HFY felt despair creeping in. Survival had been hard enough before. Now it seemed almost impossible. But Rin did not give up. He rebuilt their shelter with stronger supports and found new food sources farther away. He encouraged HFY to keep moving, to keep trying. She began to see him not just as an alien, but as a partner in survival. One evening, after a long day of gathering supplies, Haewon noticed Rin sitting apart from her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His posture was tense. She asked him what was wrong, but he only said, "Danger. Soon." That night, she dreamed of strange shadows moving through the desert, their shapes unfamiliar and threatening. When she awoke, the uneasy feeling stayed with her. The next day they heard sounds, low, growling noises carried on the wind. Rin became alert, gripping the sharpened piece of metal he used as a weapon. Haewon felt fear rising inside her. Whatever lived on this planet, they were not alone. As the sun set, dark shapes appeared in the distance, moving closer with every passing moment. Rin stood in front of Haewon, shielding her. She knew then that whatever happened, they would face it together. The days on the deserted planet became longer for Haewon and Reiner. They had found a rhythm to their survival, but each day carried its own challenges. The sun was hot and bright, and the nights were cold. Haewon often sat near the fire they made from dry plants, thinking about home, but she also found herself thinking about Reiner more than she expected. He had saved her life more than once, and his quiet strength was something she could not ignore. One morning they went to the rocky cliffs to search for food. Reiner had shown her how to find roots that grew under certain plants. He used his strong hands to pull them out, while Haewon cleaned them with water from their small stream. As they worked, Reiner spoke in his deep, slow voice. "Storm coming," he said, pointing at the horizon. Haewon looked and saw dark clouds rolling toward them. She could feel the wind changing. They hurried back to their shelter. Reiner had built it partly under a rock overhang to keep them safe from rain and wind. That night the storm arrived. Rain poured hard and the wind howled. Haewon sat close to Reiner, feeling the heat from his body. She had never been so close to him before, and she noticed the strange but calming rhythm of his breathing. The storm lasted for 2 days. They stayed inside, talking only when they needed to. Haewon told Reiner stories about Earth, about green fields, food markets, and the sea. Reiner listened carefully, sometimes asking questions about things he had never seen. In return, he told her about his homeworld, a place with red skies and silver rivers. His people lived in tall crystal towers and could see stars even in the day. When the storm finally passed, the land looked different. Some of the plants had been torn from the ground, and small pools of water had formed. While exploring, Haewon found strange fruit floating in one of the pools. She picked it up and took it back to Reiner. He examined it closely. "Safe to eat," he said after smelling it. They tasted it together. It was sweet and juicy, unlike anything Haewon had eaten before. For the first time in days, she laughed, and Reiner smiled in return. As days passed, their bond grew stronger. They began to understand each other without words. When Haewon felt tired, Reiner would slow his pace for her. When Reiner seemed troubled, she would quietly share her food with him without asking. Trust was forming and it felt natural. One evening, while they were preparing food, they heard a distant sound, something mechanical. It was faint but real. Haewon's heart raced. "Could it be a ship?" she asked. Reiner shook his head slowly. "Not rescue. Danger." They quickly put out their fire and hid behind the rocks. The sound grew louder. Soon they saw a small flying drone scanning the area. Reiner explained that it belonged to a hostile alien faction. If it found them, they would be taken, or worse. They stayed hidden until the drone passed. Haewon could see that Reiner was tense. He told her they had to move their camp farther away. That night, they gathered their supplies and traveled under the light of the twin moons. The journey was hard. The land was rocky, and the night air was cold. Haewon stumbled more than once, but Reiner was always there to help her up. They finally stopped near a cave hidden by thick vines. It was damp inside, but it would hide them well. As they settled in, Haewon looked at Reiner and whispered, "Thank you." He looked at her with his strange, glowing eyes and replied, "We survived together." Something had changed between them. It was not just survival anymore, it was connection, something unspoken but powerful. And in that quiet cave, with the danger still out there, HFY knew that their story was only beginning. The days on the deserted planet grew hotter, and the nights colder. HFY and Rian had adjusted to the strange rhythm of the place, but it was still a constant struggle. The shelter they had built kept them safe from the strongest winds, but food and water were always a challenge. Each day, they would walk together toward the distant cliffs where the alien fruit trees grew, collecting enough for a few days. Rian had grown weaker since the last storm. HFY noticed how he coughed more often and took slower steps. She tried to make him rest, but he insisted on helping. She could see that he was worried about her too, especially now that her body had started to change. It was becoming harder to move quickly, and she needed to rest more often. Still, she did not let herself slow down too much. She knew they both had to keep going. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, HFY looked at Rian and said softly, "We cannot survive here forever. We need to find a way off this planet." Rian nodded, his golden eyes catching the firelight. "I know," he replied. "There may be a way. I have seen something far to the north. It looks like an old structure, maybe a crash site or a station. If it still works, it could send a signal." The idea gave them hope, but it also meant a long and dangerous journey. The northern lands were unknown to them. They had heard strange sounds from that direction, cries that echoed across the plains. But the thought of staying here until they were too weak to move was worse. The next morning they packed what little they had: dried fruit, a few containers of water, and sharp tools made from alien stone. Rian helped HFY carry the heavier items, even though his own strength was not what it once was. They began their trek north, walking through wide stretches of dry land where strange insects scuttled across the sand. At night, they found shelter in rocky caves, keeping a small fire going to ward off the cold and any creatures that might be near. HFY sometimes woke to the sound of Rian coughing in the dark, but he always waved her concern away with a tired smile. On the fourth day, they reached a series of jagged cliffs. Climbing them was slow and dangerous. HFY slipped once, scraping her arm on the sharp rock, but Rian pulled her to safety. At the top they could see far into the distance. There, half buried in the sand, was something metallic, reflecting the sunlight. Took another day to reach it. The object was indeed an old structure, larger than they expected. Its walls were dented and worn, and strange symbols were carved into the metal. They found a door half open, and inside was a dark corridor that smelled of rust and dust. They moved carefully, listening for any sound. Deep inside they discovered a control room. The panels were covered with dust, and many of the lights were dead. But one screen flickered faintly when Rian touched it. He worked on the controls, his long fingers moving quickly over the symbols. HFY watched him, her heart beating faster with hope. Finally Rian looked up. "I think I can send a signal," he said. "It may take time and I do not know if anyone will hear it. But it is better than nothing." He began the process and a low hum filled the room. They stayed there for the night, sleeping in a corner where the metal floor was still warm from the machines. For the first time in many weeks, HFY let herself dream of seeing other people again, of leaving the endless sands behind. In the morning, however, they woke to a sound that chilled them both. From outside came a deep, echoing roar. It was close. Rian stood quickly, moving toward the door. HFY followed, her hand on her stomach, fear rising in her chest. Out in the sand, a huge shadow moved. It was a creature unlike anything they had seen before, with thick scales and eyes that glowed in the dim light. It turned its head toward them, and the ground seemed to shake as it stepped closer. Rian grabbed HFY's hand. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. He picked up one of their stone weapons, though it looked small compared to the size of the beast. The creature roared again and began to charge. Rian pushed HFY back inside the structure, standing at the doorway. The air was filled with the sound of its heavy steps. The signal machine hummed quietly in the background, a fragile thread of hope in the middle of danger. HFY felt her heart pounding. She did not know if help would come in time, but she knew they could not give up now. They had survived storms, hunger, and cold. They would face this too. The roar came closer, and Rian took a step forward, ready to protect her with everything he had.